In fact, there's a degree to which I'm afraid I'm going to reject the question because
You are,
when we
or
talk,
reject the
I
question.
am,
Okay.
right, because I have to come back with disruptive for whom?
Dr. Friedel, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for taking the time for this conversation with me. AI's impact on many industries, such as the movie industry most recently, they went on strike, is in part the inspiration for our conversation, my conversation with you, such as how new technologies impact our world. So let's start with a foundational question here. How do we define a technology as disruptive?
No, that does not have a simple answer, as you might guess.
Yeah.
Uh, you have to, in fact, there's a degree to which I'm afraid I'm going to reject the question because
You are,
when we
or
talk,
reject the
I
question.
am,
Okay.
right, because I have to come back with disruptive for whom? Uh, because
Ah,
one of the things that you have to think about whenever you're talking about the influence of a technology is that technologies have very different kinds of effects on different kinds of people. Uh, and what may be disruptive for you might be sort of hum hum for me. Uh, so now I know what we're talking about is something on a larger social scale,
yeah,
but
yeah.
even at that scale, we end up with the need to differentiate both in terms of who and in terms of when, because some technologies have very quick effects on certain populations, and those effects take time to have larger ripple effects. So, uh, what is disruptive in a technology? When technologies lead us, and I use that term very carefully, when technologies lead us to do things substantially differently from the way we did them before.
Would one way of defining technology be disruptive technology be technologies that change status quo? So,
Again, the, the lack of specificity in that characterization just doesn't work because, again, my status quo is not your status quo. Okay, my particular condition, social, economic, cultural, physical, uh, is mine. You might have a technology that, in fact, changes your situation, any number of elements of that condition substantially, but it may not change mine. Or, as I said, there's a chronological element here. It may change yours quickly. It may not change mine for a generation.
okay, if there's not a clear, even or succinct definition of what it means to be disruptive as far as technology goes, are there technologies that have been labeled disruptive in our history?
Yes.
Yes. So, for example, AI is one that everyone talks about how it's going to change everything. So, historically, give us some examples, please.
Um, my favorite example of a disruptive technology, not everybody because it's so old, but printing with movable type. Okay,
Printing with movable type. Okay.
printing with movable type. When uh, 20 or so years ago, when the millennium was about to turn, I was approached by any number of journalists and media people saying, what would you call the most important technology of the last 1,000 years? And they clearly wanted me to say something like the internet or the computer or something like that. And I would sort of see their faces fall as I would say, I would say Guttenberg and his printing press. And if they permitted me at that point, I then explained that you want a technology that eventually changes everything. That's one. And that's my favorite example.
Why did the movable type printing with movable type change everything, you think?
Because one of the most fundamental things about human beings is how they communicate with one another, how they remember things, how they teach things, how they learn things, and how they capture their culture. And printing transformed all of those things. Again, it's an example of where it changed it for some people very quickly. It changed it for other people much more slowly. It changed it for some people profoundly. Those are the ones that were literate, or already knew what a book was and knew what to do with it. The people who didn't know what books were or what to do with it, it took a generation or two.
That's actually a really great example to talk about sort of the temporal impact of a technology. Right. Earlier, you were saying, it can change, bring change for different people or different segments of society at different times. And this is a prime example of that. If you ain't reading, if you ain't literate, right. Whether it's handwritten or it's printed, it doesn't make a difference to you, right?
Exactly. That's exactly right. That's right.
And I think another thing that it probably made books much cheaper, and perhaps not in the full immediate term, but in the long term.
Well, cheap. That's sort of an understatement. It made books much more plentiful. It transformed the book from something that was rare and typically treasured, that was tightly confined to a particular location because of the labor and effort that had gone into producing it.
Some of them were even chained to library shelves or whatever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly right. And even if it wasn't chained, you certainly weren't allowed to walk away with it. So we then transformed the book within it, in some cases within as little as a single generation, into something for which there is a widespread market, for which there are much greater audiences. People begin to see the possibility of using books and literature for things like engineering, for example. One of my favorite examples is that once you begin to have printed books, people can make it worth their while to write down the recipe for things or the instructions on how to make things, to give you illustrations on how the machines work and how everything fits together, and then to put that out where everybody can see it.
Like in a patent.
But I can't overstate how radical that is, because we were in a world where knowledge and techniques were largely kept hidden, or if not hidden exactly, they were so precious that you were very careful about who you told about it, about what kind of information and knowledge you let out. But once it became possible to make these things readily available and actually to create markets, the whole idea of a market for books, that seems so obvious to us, but before the printing press, there really isn't a market for books.
Yeah, it didn't exist. Yeah.
So that's why that's my key example of a disruptive technology. But as you point out, it illustrates how complex the notion of disruption is. Even when it's on that gigantic scale, you have to talk about who being disrupted and how and when.
Dr. Friedel, at the turn of the millennium, reporters came to you and asked you for the most disruptive technology over the last 1,000 years. So let me refine that question. How about one or two disruptive technologies in the last couple of 100 years? Do you have favorites? Do you have favorites? Or
fair enough. I do. One that is obviously a favorite of mine because I paid a bit of close attention to it is electric light and power. That is introduced about 150 years ago. And it builds on another only slightly less disruptive technology, and that was telegraphy.
calligraphy, okay.
So the telegraph introduced people to electricity. Okay, before that it was nothing, just a plaything and a sort of little oddity that scientists would fiddle around with. But once you figure out how to make electromagnetic...
I'm sorry, let me interject you here if I may, please. When you said
Sure.
the telegraph introduced people to electricity, this is because it made it immediately useful for them, and that's how they got introduced to it. Is that
Right.
is that the reason behind it? Okay.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And it I mean, a telegraph is essentially a use for an electromagnet.
Yeah.
So this is a good example of something that was just a kind of philosophical tool, something or even a toy. But once you show that it can be used for long distance communication, and that you can do so reliably and at large scale, then people start paying attention to electricity. And that's important because people weren't experimenting that much with electricity until this point. It was, as I said, it was very esoteric. But it becomes less esoteric when it becomes economically important. And that's where Edison is a great example, because Thomas Edison learned to be a telegrapher, and then he learned to make money by improving telegraph instruments. And that's what gets him to think about electricity and what other uses can be made for it. And then when, as I said, about 150 years ago, we get the introduction of the electric light and then the power systems that go with it, we again have a very widespread disruptive technology. It takes 2 or 3 generations to have that kind of effect, but the effect was profound and widespread.
One of your favorites in the last 200 as far as disruptive technologies is concerned is the electric light and power. We just discussed that. Let's talk about its disruptiveness. Why was that disruptive? What did it disrupt?
Okay. Well, let me back up a little bit. Again, this whole question of disruption, and think about what technologies actually do, and how do we understand what effect technologies have. And one way that I describe this is that technologies change the choices that people make. Technology does not make us do anything.
Huh.
It changes the choices that we ourselves make. And it's a good question. We have to study. Every time a technology comes along, every time we want to understand its significance, we have to ask ourselves, what are the choices that technology changes? How does it change those choices? Now, when we start asking that question, then there are all sorts of wonderful issues that then come to the fore. One of them is whose choices? Who is making the choices for whom, for that matter? So in the case of electric light and power, for example, at a very obvious level, light is one of those things that human beings like to have and like to have control over. And the electric light gives those who can afford it, which at first was only a small number, the ability to manage and control light, as I said, which is kind of a universal value, very readily. And then the choices that they have about the use of electric power then give them all sorts of choices that they can then use in all sorts of ways. In the household, for example, you can then begin to have electric fans and electric motors of one sort or another. You transform transportation by giving people choices. They don't have to take electric streetcars, but when you give them electric streetcars, you say you can either have an electric streetcar or you can take this horse-drawn omnibus. People tend to go for the electric streetcars. And then the implication, the second and third order effects of the choice of, say, taking the electric streetcar are themselves ways of changing choices of people. Then they live in different parts of cities, for example, because they now have streetcar suburbs. They live in high-rise buildings because they now have electric motors that will operate elevators.
And air conditioning, right? So they don't bake in there.
Eventually, you get into air conditioning and a whole host of things of that sort. But again, I hope you begin to see how useful it is to start thinking about choices, because I don't have to live in a high-rise building. I don't have to live in a climate that calls for air conditioning, but choices have now been given to me to do so. And that's when we begin to understand what technology's effects really are.
That's true. There are many small operations, restaurants or little snack shops that no longer take cash. You have to use your credit card or your Apple Pay, and then you make a choice. Do I want to buy from these guys, or do I want to go to the next
That's
booth?
right.
We'll be back after a short break to talk about society's reaction to disruptive technologies. We'll be back.